Hello everyone, I am Ioana Kish, one of the co-conveners of the BSA Theory Study Group, and I will be chairing the event today. I just wanted to start this introduction by saying thank you everyone for making the time to join us today after possibly many of you not having had the chance to sleep much due to the US elections results night. We chose the date of this event much earlier in the year, and it so happens that it's being held just a day after the US presidential election. So to what extent this coincidence ought to be regarded as being of note remains to be seen in the upcoming talks and the Q&A. Beyond the topic of elections and electoralism, however, we are here to celebrate and discuss the Frankfurt School's long-lasting and incisive political, praxeological, and theoretical work and legacy, which has now surpassed a whole century. That said, this event is not only about looking back at the excellent work of Adorno, Marcuse, Horkheimer, and others. We want to also highlight and discuss the highly interdisciplinary insights, praxis, and work of the current generation of Frankfurt School critical theorists and political economists, many of whom are already highlighted in Chris O'Kane's excellent piece, which I will be sharing with you in the chat in a few minutes. And it was published on the History of Ideas blog, published in January 2024. So today we would like to collectively consider the priorities that current critical theory and critical political economy scholars are seeking to address, and perhaps what other directions future anti-capitalist scholarship and activism may take. We live in a time of what many have called a polycrisis of capitalism, a time of climate disaster, a time in which fascism is on the rise, and a time when an ongoing genocide of Palestinian people continues to unfold before our eyes with the support of so many political, military, and economic actors. It's also a time of increased precarity and day-to-day insecurity, including within the academy, which often forces scholars to undertake critical theory work at the margins of higher education. The political project of the Frankfurt School continues to provide crucial and critical questions, warnings, and epistemic horizons. So we're here to ask the question, what next? And some directions are already offered in the Institute for Social Research's recent Perspectives document, published as a working paper. To help us take these discussions forward, we're joined today by four eminent scholars of critical theory. I will be brief with the introduction of some of their most recent work, but I will be linking the events biographies on the event page in the chat in a few seconds. Cecilia Sebastian's work helps us understand Angela Davis's critique and expansion of the Frankfurt School's theory of fascism through her abolitionist critique of mass incarceration. Chris O'Kane's most recent publication addresses the topic of the Marx revival and state theory by engaging with a negative, non-dialectical, critical social theory of the state. Esteban Torres's most recent publication in English takes us towards a critical theory of world society, and Stephan Lessenich's latest article in English invites us to push solidarity beyond the boundaries of its institutionalization in the national welfare state. Each guest speaker will deliver a brief 15-minute talk in the order listed on the events page. And following these four talks, the guest speakers will be invited to offer a very brief response to one another's contributions. We will then take a 5-minute comfort break, which will be followed by a Q&A session with audience members until 6 p.m. GMT. We will be video recording the first part of this event up until the comfort break. And if you do not wish to appear in the video recording, please turn your camera off, as well as, of course, your microphone. And finally, during the Q&A, we encourage thoughtful and respectful debates. Any disruptions or unpleasant behavior will result in removal from the Zoom session. Should you wish to discuss any decisions related to this, you are welcome to contact me or the BSA events team after the event. So I would like now to invite our first guest speaker, Stephan.
Yes. Thank you, Joanna. Thanks to all the theory study group of the BSA for the organization of this event, and thank you specifically for organizing it and sharing it today. I will be sharing a PowerPoint presentation for my short 15 minutes talk, hoping that everybody is able to see it. I will be talking about the political economy of what in the tradition of critical theory has been called for decades late capitalism, and which I would argue that in our times should be called latest capitalism. I will argue for that change in conceptualization, and I will be talking of the politics of as if. So in a sense, the ideological reproduction of the political economy of late or latest capitalism. My short presentation today is to be seen in the context of the research perspective paper of the Institut für Sozialforschung, the Institute for Social Research here in Frankfurt, which was published roughly a year ago, and which you may find on the website of the Institute. I will put the link into the chat after my talk, so you can have a look at it. And I will be happy to refer to this perspectives paper of the IFS more directly and more specifically in our later discussion. And actually, the talk on the political economy of latest capitalism relates to what has been happening in the US in these last hours, which I would argue is the next step on the long march of democratic capitalism into a new mode of fascist transformation of society. I will be my starting point as the starting point in the IFS research perspectives paper as well. I will be starting with the notion of existential problems. Existential problems constitute, I would argue, structural threats to the social reproduction of, and this is the main thread of the discourse on existential problems today, a threat to the social reproduction of humanity or mankind, the planet, in the context of the socio-ecological crises. And I would argue that existential problems constitute structural threats as well for the form of constitution of the political and economic constitution of late modern societies, of democratic capitalist societies. So democratic capitalism is under threat of its social reproduction as well, by way of the increasing significance of existential problems. And most prominently, I would refer here, and the IFS research perspectives paper refers to that as well as an instance of illustration of the argument. Most prominently, this is climate change as an existential problem, arguably the existential problem of our times, and the existential problem for the social reproduction of the political and economic form of late modern societies. Interestingly, existential problems may be seen as an extraordinary add-on to the ordinary normal crisis dynamics characterizing the rich post-industrial political economies. So critical theory of late modern capitalism is a crisis theory, always has been a crisis theory. And I would say that are normal reproduction crises of late modern capitalism, and now existential problems like climate change will add on the normal crisis-ridden reproduction mechanisms of late modern societies. And in that context, I would argue that the current constellation of societal contradictions with normal crises, characterizing the reproduction of late modern societies, plus the existential problems as an add-on on that. This calls for a rediscovery and critical reappraisal of the so-called theory of late capitalism. So I refer to a strand of, one may say, the second generation of critical theory, Frankfurt style, and the theory of late capitalism as it was developed here in Frankfurt and in parts of the US in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And maybe this links to Chris' presentation he will give afterwards. And I would refer to a specific strand of this late capitalist theory. I think one of the maybe the most important author in in this field was Klaus Offe with his critical theory of late capitalism, developed in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. Klaus Offe, who was assistant to Jürgen Habermas in the late 1960s or 70s here in Frankfurt. And the starting point of late capitalism theory, Offe's style, is the so-called problem overload, resulting from a structural gap between, on the one hand, problem-generating mechanisms of a system, and on the other hand, problem processing capacities of a system. And if I am talking here of systems, this is a note to the, well, systems theory neo-Marxism Klaus Offe developed at that time, with a recourse on systems theory before its autopoietical turn. So classical systems theory, and here as a problem diagnosis, the gap between problem-generating mechanisms and problem-processing capacities. And the main problem, the central problem of reproduction of late capitalist societies, Offe identified, was a contradicting functional imperative, the contradiction between capitalism and democracy. So the contradiction between the logics of two societal macro structures. The logic of capitalism as a system of material inequality and the reproduction of material inequalities, and democracy as a system of at least formal equality and the reproduction of formal equalities. There are several reformulations of this contradicting construction of late capitalist polities. You may say that's a contradiction between capital as a social entity and the demos, between economic elites and the electorate, if you want to. But the main contradiction he identified was in terms of functional imperatives, the imperative of accumulation versus the imperative of legitimation. So an economic imperative late capitalist societies are confronted with, so to foster profitability, economic profitability in the long run, and the ever new accumulation of capital on the one hand, and the social acceptance of state activities fostering capital accumulation. So the legitimation function is the second central function to the late capitalist state, as Offe puts it. And these are contradicting, not only conflicting, but contradicting antagonistic imperatives in his view. So late capitalism theory may be called, or may be seen as a political theory of a double bind. So the capitalist state and democratic state as the instance of stabilizing capitalism and democracy, and holding them in a balance, and of stabilizing this contradictory arrangement of accumulation and legitimation. The late capitalist state is, well, confronted with two antagonistic imperatives, and if he doesn't solve accumulation problems, that lead legitimation problems. So crises of the growth society translate into crisis of the social acceptance of the democratic system and the economic system, and legitimation problems on the other hand. So protests and social non-acceptance of things as they are breeds accumulation problems. And in this sense, Offe would say late capitalism is a system, a political and economic system, which is in permanent crisis, in a permanent stabilization crisis between accumulation and legitimation. There is a structural necessity for permanent crisis management, and this is a system that is prone to second-order crisis of crisis management. Crisis management is the order of the day, and there are continuously crises of this crisis management, which is expected from the state, and which the state has to deliver in a sense. And Offe's next argument is that there is a historical emergence of a set of backing mechanisms, of stabilization mechanisms of this late capitalist system, torn between accumulation and legitimation. And I only want to mention this set of three backing mechanisms. In the first instance, he says market organization. So cartelization, monopolization of capital is one contradictory instance of stabilizing late capitalism. Then the institutionalization of technological progress and the development of public infrastructures is the second stabilization mechanism, and the welfare state is the third and highest stage in the sense of stabilizing this contradictory arrangement between accumulation and legitimation imperatives. The welfare state of the 1960s, 70s, he has in his mind when writing his late capitalism theory. And he calls late capitalism because the argument is that the political toolkit for system stabilization is categorically, as he says, exhausted. So the thesis was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there is no further instrument beyond these three instruments to stabilize a democratic capitalist system and to try to bring into order the accumulation legitimation system. Because of this, he said late capitalism, not because he was advancing the demise of the system for the next year or the years to come, but because there was a dilemma of late capitalism not being able to enlarge the political toolkit, the instruments for stabilizing the system. And this dysfunctional functionality then he constitutes a dysfunctional functionality of this accumulation-driven and welfare state-based output democracy. He says the system lives of an output democracy. Social acceptance is linked to the output of the accumulation process. And he says that already in the 1960s and 1970s, there were visible that this system of stabilization of accumulation legitimation through the welfare state was dysfunctionally functional because there was a long rise in discipline and control, in social inequalities, and in ecological destruction, which then has been a topic in the last years. So in order of existential problems in late capitalism, I think the central question for late capitalist theory in the 1960s and 70s, and more so today, is how a structurally crisis-ridden social formation, which has reached the limits of its problem-solving capacities, can deal with the supposed eruption of existential problems like, for example, climate changes. A system that is exhausted in its capacities for problem solving is now confronted with a mega problem, an existential problem like climate change. And my answer would be that there's a fourth backing mechanism stabilizing late capitalism, a mechanism which interestingly was explicitly ruled out by late capitalism theory, and it's ideology. So beyond the materialists' arguments that author puts forward, there he says ideology isn't able to restabilize this crisis-ridden system. You can't refer to the old bourgeois ideologies of family values or of nationalism or of anti-communism at that time to restabilize this materially contradictory system. And I would say, yes, you can. Late capitalist societies invest a plethora of institutional resources in the production of instrumental social knowledge about the inner systemic manageability of the climate crisis. So there is an ideology production to suggest that climate change as an existential problem may be solved in a sense and operated through the standard operating procedures and mechanisms of late capitalist societies, polities, and economies. And I think I would say this ideological arrangement, I call this the politics of as if. And I would differentiate three modes of as-ifism in the sense constituting the irrational rationality of crisis management in our time. So three modes of suggesting that the existential problems driven forward by capitalism and democratic capitalism itself may be solved in the context and in the systemic context of late capitalism. And I would say that the first politics of, as if I would call that a politics of repression, pretending that nothing is wrong, which I would say is the majoritarian disposition of ordinary people in Western late capitalist political economies. So business as usual, show must go on, positionings are this first micro politics, you may say, of as if. The second is pretending that something is being done. That would be the mode of rationalizing the problem. So I would say this is the political programmatic of the government of the day in any of the societies which are in the context of operating in the context of late capitalism. So pretending that something is being done to solve the problem of climate change, and that everything what can be done is being done. And then there is, interestingly, a third mode of activism, solutionism, pretending that the problems can be overcome by technological innovation, by disruptive technological innovation. We can solve the climate crisis, and the only hindrance are, well, political elites that's hindered by bad governance, the breakthrough of disruptive innovations. And all of these three ideological strategies converge, as what I say, in the radicalized reproduction of the contradictions inherent to late modern capitalism: exploitation, externalization, alienation, and illusion. So I'm coming to the end. I would claim for a history, a reconstructive history of the rise and fall of late capitalism. I would say that, after yesterday, more so than before yesterday, if there ever was a historical conjuncture in which the political toolkit for the self-stabilization of democratic capitalism happened to be exhausted, it is ours. It is the times we are living in. I would claim that confronted with existential problems, late is turning into latest capitalism. And this is not only a mere play of words or an instance of, semantic pseudo-radicalism to say now we are in latest capitalism. But I would say, with the ideological means of reproduction depleted, the three modes of activism that I mentioned, and with the material contradictions of democratic capitalism getting ever more palpable, the backing mechanism of last resort, the really last resort backing mechanism of latest capitalism, is and will be open violence and war. And we see the open violence of, in that sense, with all the toolkits, without the violent mode of reproduction being exhausted, we see this open violence not only at the borders of the European Union, not only in the brutalization of everyday lives in late capitalist societies, but also in the rise of neo-fascist movements and programmatics. And against this backdrop, I think critical thinking and emancipatory action once again take on an existential significance, just as they did 100 years ago when critical theory, Frankfurt style, was, if you want so, founded. Thank you. That was it from my side for this moment. And you see the cover of the IFS Perspectives papers, and I will put you the link into the chat in a minute. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephan. I am going to remove the spotlights. Chris, are you ready?
I am ready. Hope everyone is, I guess I was going to say doing well, but maybe hanging in there is a better, more appropriate. And thanks so much to the inviters. Thanks to Stephan for his very pertinent paper. Before I begin, I just want to note that I am currently in New York City and it's 27 degrees out today. I had to turn on the air conditioning. So definitely sort of the existential contours of this crisis are very palpable for me. And sort of what I'm going to talk about, well, I'm just going to go ahead and start reading my paper. 2023 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Institute for Social Research, occasioned an outpouring of reflections on the development and current relevance of Frankfurt School critical theory by prominent figures in contemporary Frankfurt School critical theory. Across the Anglophone world in general, but I do want to make clear that the comments that I make essentially focus on the United States and the sort of predominant approach to critical theory in the United States. And here I want to say that contemporary Frankfurt School critical theory is largely synonymous with the normative, philosophical, and multidimensional social theoretical approach to critical theory, originated by Habermas, but perhaps more importantly, further developed and popularized by prominent American figures. Yet what I think is notable about many of these reflections is the palpable unease that many shared about the current state of Frankfurt School critical theory. To be sure, some of the prominent figures argued for the validity of this predominant normative philosophical approach that they had helped develop. Yet others expressed misgivings about the status of contemporary Frankfurt School critical theory. And others offered their own perspective on a refrain that I think was first introduced by Nancy Fraser in her discussion with Rahel Yegi, where she says, critical theory had lost its way. Samuel Moyn argued that the transformation of Frankfurt School critical theory into normative philosophy was responsible for its widespread unpopularity among the new left. And like Fraser and Moyn, William Scheuermann argued that critical theory had lost its way when Horkheimer and Adorno sidelined political economy on the basis of their adoption of Friedrich Pollock's theory of state capitalism. Finally, like Fraser, other figures also offered a proposal to revive critical theory by returning to and drawing on earlier modes of critical theory. Now, it seems to me that what appears to be the calling into question of this Habermasian, for lack of a better word, approach to critical theory that has been predominant in the US and, dare I say, the rest of the Anglo world since the 1980s is remarkable. Personally, I also find it encouraging. Yet, as my contribution to this discourse, which was posted in the chat, implied, right, even if people are calling into question some of the facets of the later Habermas's work, they are not yet questioning sort of the paradigm or even the justificatory basis of this approach. Now, as I argued there, and I am trying to argue in more detail, what I'm calling Habermasian critical theory was not established by Habermas himself, at least in the Anglophone world. It gained ascendancy in the late 1970s, at least in part on the basis of interpretations of the development of the early Frankfurt School that were promulgated by such figures as Albrecht Vellmer, Trent Schroyer, and perhaps most importantly, Perry Anderson and Martin Jay. And I know, just as a slight tangent, that I believe there was supposed to be a new translation of Anderson's Considerations on Western Marxism into German, and that Stephan wrote a afterword that sort of went against this interpretation. But at least in the Anglophone world, I think it's still the case, and it was the case then, that these interpretations of the early Frankfurt School have an interesting parallel with the recent reflections that I just discussed. Like Fraser, they held that critical theory had lost its way, but instead of Habermas, their criticisms were focused on Horkheimer and Adorno's late approach to critical theory that was said to have abandoned its Marxian political economic bases for a one-dimensional theory of totally administered society that eschewed praxis. People also argued that Habermas's early critical theory was said to offer an approach that returns to the early Horkheimer, but remedied some of his normative social theoretical and theoretical practical deficits. Now, although Habermas himself has gone on record as stating that the Frankfurt School is an archipelago, the rise of what Murray Bookchin referred to as Habermas Limited in the US was further justified by the ascendancy of the convention of treating the development of critical theory as a progressive and an evolutionary generational process, where Habermas became the figure of the second generation and the approach to critical theory he developed, championed by these prominent figures, became synonymous with Frankfurt School critical theory. Now, although I work on the Frankfurt School and I attempt to do contemporary critical theory, I am not a prominent figure. I am marginal at best. This perhaps has to do with my pedigree, but I think it also has to do with what I focus on. For as was already implied, my research tries to call these foundational premises of what I'm calling Habermasian critical theory into question by A, offering an alternative interpretation of the developments of Frankfurt School critical theory as a heterodox Marxian critical theory of social domination of capitalist society as a negative totality that is premised on a unique interpretation of the critique of political economy and developing sort of a contemporary critical theory that draws on this approach. Now, today, I just want to quickly provide an outline of both of these strands of my work through a close reading of some published comments by a figure who was initially, in the Anglophone literature at least, defined as one of the members of the second generation, but who in later years was not mentioned as often, and that is Alfred Schmidt. Alfred Schmidt was a student and later assistant of Horkheimer and Adorno. They supervised his dissertation. His first book based on his dissertation, The Concept of Nature and Marx, was published in a book series they edited. And as the English preface to The Concept of Nature states, it was written under the influence of the specific interpretation of Marx that the Frankfurt School had first developed in the 1930s. Now, as this suggests, Schmidt saw a continuity between the specific Marxian early critical theory of Horkheimer and the approach to critical theory in the 1960s that is reflected as in his interpretation of Marx. The fact that Schmidt's interpretation of Marx's concept of nature provides a more thorough basis for Horkheimer and Adorno's notion of the domination of nature, society as nature, and nature as society. The domination of socio-natural second nature and natural history further implies this. Finally, the fact that Adorno would later rely on this work in negative dialectics to articulate his notion of natural history further suggests not only continuity, but that the late Adorno did not abandon this unique interpretation of Marx's political economy. Now, in particular, I think Schmidt makes a number of comments in a published discussion with Werner Rehfeld in a book that was published in 1968 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Marx's birth. Here, Schmidt states that the so-called Frankfurt School goes back mainly to the concept of a critical theory of society developed by Horkheimer in the 1930s, a conception that owes a great deal to Marx's teaching, and above all sees in contrast to the codified Soviet Marxist conception that the main point of this teaching lies in the critique of political economy. The difference between this school and those techniques of research that are generally accepted in the social science today is, to put it briefly, that the Frankfurt School admits society is a concrete yet negative totality. Now, as I read it, Schmidt is making a number of explicit claims here about the continuity of the distinct heterodox Marxism of the early Horkheimer and late Adorno's critical theory from the 1930s to at least 1968. And as Schmidt states, this approach to critical theory owes a great deal to Marx's teaching. At the main point of this teaching lies in the critique of political economy. And as Schmidt further states, on this basis, the Frankfurt School critiques society as a concrete yet negative totality, in which, as he elaborates elsewhere, the basic antagonisms that run through society must be reflected in any of its sectors. Finally, Schmidt also states in this conversation that the political position that develops from here holds that taking a left-wing position means, first of all, that one regards society as an objective reality and not merely as a classifying concept that subsumes groups of phenomena. This is because, as he also says, the question is no longer simply to increase productivity, but to prevent people from becoming the slaves of their own productive forces. In other words, to bring the whole of this process under the conscious control of mankind as a whole. Now, I didn't prepare the book I'm currently working on with these passages in mind, yet I think they point to the main contours of what I see as this sort of particular interpretation of the critique of political economy and its role in this approach to critical theory, at least. And the book sort of reconstructs this by looking at Horkheimer and then Adorno, and then by seeing how it was taken up by figures who are often grouped in other schools like value form theory or open Marxism, but which I interpret as, people who are trying to further develop this research program of critical theory. And this is Schmidt, as was mentioned, Backhaus, Reichelt, Moish-Bastone, and Werner Bonefeld. Last but not least, I then sort of want to draw together these figures and also, draw on my own thinking and some more current research to sort of argue for the contemporary relevance of this conception of critical theory and its critique of capitalist society. Now, as Schmidt indicates, such a critical theory will conceive of society as an independent reality constituted by the antagonistic unity of unfreedom of the interrelated domains of society, which inverts to compel the actions of individuals in these domains, a negative concrete totality. Now, at the same time, further mirroring Schmidt's comments, such a critical theory will critique, sort of approaches to contemporary society, to contemporary capitalism, which amount to debates over classifications of different types of domination, or over which type of institution or group is the revolutionary subject or potential revolutionary subject, and which institution or group is an impediment to revolutionary transformation. Now, certainly, this provides an all too condensed overview of my current research and a not too worked out outline of my future research, but I think it also provides an orientation to the notion of Frankfurt School critical theory that I at least look back on in response to its 100th anniversary, but even more importantly, that I look to take forward in its 101st or 102nd year. And I do hope that it will have some impact on reevaluating understandings of the Frankfurt School and the critique of political economy, and of revitalizing contemporary critical theory at a moment when the predominant approach to critical theory of the last several decades seems itself to be in crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for an excellent contribution. I would like to invite Cecilia to start your talk.
Yes, I am here. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you, Joanna and the BSA Theory Study Group for having me here today. I'm really honored to be on this panel talking about critical theory. I drafted my comments before the US election results, so I'm going to stick to what I wrote, which I still think is relevant, but I also think the US election results are relevant. So especially if in the discussion we're discussing political strategy, maybe that will be a moment to come back to them. What I wanted to do was start out by laying out what I think all four of us panelists share, and then I'll briefly touch on the anti-imperialist and abolitionist strains of the Frankfurt School that I think will be vital to reorienting critical theory now and in the future. I took some time this weekend to reread the IFS perspective statements and read some of my co-panelists' work. And it struck me that we all begin with a similar starting point, one that Chris sort of mentioned just now. We share an investment in seeing the project of Frankfurt School critical theory continued. And at the same time, there's a mutual sense that going forward with critical theory requires first going back. And by that, I mean, I think everyone on this panel, to different degrees perhaps, feels that Habermasian academic philosophy is simply not doing the work of ruthless criticism in the interest of collective emancipation. Perhaps it's become too abstract, too divorced from the critique of capitalist political economy and from the social sciences. It has made too many concessions to Germany's post-war liberal democratic order. And therefore, to recommit critical theory to the work of critique and emancipation requires returning to that interdisciplinary Marxist project that Horkheimer outlined in the 1930s. And this is what I read the IFS Perspectives working paper to be doing. It calls for new empirical research into capitalism and social psychology, with special emphasis on the material conditions of the climate crisis and the dominant psychologies that either catastrophize or deny or diminish the climate crisis, all of which functions to make collective political action seem impossible today, even if it's not. At the same time, and Chris was mentioning just now, one of the things that I'm finding striking about this past year's celebrations of the Institute's centennial is that the call to revive the original project of critical theory, or the interdisciplinary Marxism of Horkheimer, has now been made many times over, to the point that it's even constituting something like a new consensus. This was what Chris was just describing, and I'm sorry for repeating it. But yeah, we've seen several persuasive cases just listed for recollecting some of the critical lessons of the first generation of the Frankfurt School. And this is sort of where I put on my intellectual historian hat. What I find kind of interesting about them is that they're not really new at all. They have been made on and off over the past 6 decades. And I just want to give one example. From 1947, so not even 2 years out from the end of the war, Herbert Marcuse wrote to Adorno and Horkheimer that it was high time to renew the collective interdisciplinary project of critical theory, and significantly that the new critical theory would now especially need to attend to those proletarians who advanced capitalist society had failed to integrate. So Marcuse says, in quotes, these are agricultural and migrant workers, minorities, the colonized and half colonized, and prisoners. And I think you might note, if you're following the discourse, that the Frankfurt School's contemporary critics, whether they are imminent critics or otherwise, have been saying very much the same thing. So to bring this around to my own research, the last time that demands for restoring the Frankfurt School to its original critical political project kind of reached something like a fever pitch in the public arena was in the 1960s, when socialist students in West Germany, who had been inspired by the history of the Institute, and its leading representatives in Frankfurt, Horkheimer, and Adorno, had lost sight of the project. And this comes up in the IFS statement quite early on. But what I found in doing my research is that what's often forgot about this moment is both what it was about critical theory that inspired the students in the first place and why they ultimately fell out with their professors. And if you read the archive in its international historical context, let's say, it turns out that what moved socialist students to embrace critical theory in the 1960s was not just the critique of culture industry and not just the integration thesis, though those things were important, but it is also the Frankfurt School's critique of racialized violence as an outward manifestation of capitalism's crisis tendencies, which early members had, of course, developed in response to their own historical experience with eliminationist anti-Semitism. And the reason that the students then fell out with their professors was that Horkheimer and Adorno kind of bluntly refused to extend these categories of analysis to Vietnam, where the US military, with financial support from the Federal Republic, was engaged in a televised terror campaign of napalm and carpet bombing. So in other words, like what drew students in the 1960s to critical theory was its analytic categories and political commitments, which seemed incredibly relevant to the era of decolonization. And what motivated their critique of Adorno and Horkheimer was that Adorno and Horkheimer were publicly on the record kind of naturalizing colonial and neo-colonial violence rather than viewing it as both political and preventable. So the first thing that I wanted to suggest in my time here is that there are still lessons to be learned from this original anti-imperialist critique of critical theory, in part because it saw itself as immanent to the Frankfurt School tradition, in part because it thought it could use the tools, the analytic tools of critical theory to understand this moment, even when its foremost representatives kind of were refusing that a critical appropriation, let's say. And likewise, I think there are lessons to be learned from the students' commitment to solidaristic practice with the colonized, despite profound differences in material experience. Herbert Marcuse famously called this the solidarity of reason and sentiment. And I do think that it's not a stretch to say that we're seeing something very similar motivating anti-war student protesters today, students protesting the war in Gaza today. So my first point is that anti-imperialist one. The second one concerns abolitionism. So one of the people who comes up in Frankfurt's anti-imperialist left is Angela Davis, the Black radical communist, now feminist abolitionist. She kind of goes missing in a lot of the intellectual history of the Frankfurt School, but I just want to kind of recenter her because I think she can help put critical theory on better footing for the next century if it lasts that long. So let me just say something about her Frankfurt School bona fides, because I think these are often important in intellectual histories of the Frankfurt School. Davis, who was born under Jim Crow racial apartheid in 1944, did her undergraduate studies with Marcuse at Brandeis. In 1965, she finished those and moved to Frankfurt to do graduate work with Adorno. And she was there for 2 years until July 1967. And it was right at the end of this period that Horkheimer actually publicly comes out and endorses the US war in Vietnam, which precipitates the conflict with the student movement. Again, I feel like this is not always the story we're told about the conflict. I'm seeing that my video is skipping, and I hope that people can hear me. So in classes, in student newspapers, students in Frankfurt are demanding to know whether critical theory has always been an imperialist project, and whether it has anything at all to offer people who are actively engaged in liberation struggle. And Davis is very much an active participant in making this critique. She lives with several important SDS activists like Hans-Jürgen Krahl, She transcribed pirate editions of Horkheimer's early work that are cited in the critique of the actual Horkheimer, and so forth. But nevertheless, in 1967, Davis decides to return to the US to do her PhD in philosophy with Marcuse, who is now in San Diego, and she becomes a leader of the Black liberation movement in Southern California. And in 1970, she's incarcerated for allegedly conspiring to kidnap and murder a judge. These charges are false, and she is later acquitted. Still, while she's in prison for 2 years, 1970 to 1972, she begins to articulate prison abolition as both a critical theory of society and a political practice. So what Davis argues in the 1970s is that the New Left urgently needs to address the obstacles to class struggle posed by the state's coercive apparatus, that is police and prisons. And this is not only because of their latent fascist potential, and she makes that Frankfurt School argument, but also because the decline in blue-collar labor since the 1950s means that a workerist focus on organizing industrial shop floors is becoming insufficient. It ignores the plight of a growing minoritized underclass who have been expelled from the industrial wage relation and are finding their lives increasingly organized by what she then calls the law enforcement judicial penal apparatus, now typically called the prison industrial complex. So today we actually usually look to Davis's comrade, the abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, for the definitive critique of carceral capitalist political economy. Gilmore argues that prisons emerged in the US in the post-Keynesian era as a political economic fix to several surplus crises. These are crises of finance capital, of surplus labor, surplus land, and surplus state capacity. And instead, Davis is usually credited with doing the ideology critique of punishment. So delinking punishment from crime, showing mass incarceration to belong to this longer lineage of racial domination in the US. But I think what you can find if you look at Davis's entire work, including the very early work on this, is that the critique of political economy is always right there with the ideology critique. And both are informed by a philosophy of freedom that she develops in her studies. And the result is that you really get something that looks a lot like that interdisciplinary Marxism that we're all trying to revive. So it's sort of living proof that it's possible. The abolitionist critique of prisons relies on the critique of capitalist political economy, sort of buttressed by sociological data, but at the same time, in a philosophical register, it insists that freedom cannot be reduced to the negative demonstration that some of us are free because other people are locked up. It must also have positive content, and to the extent that that positive content does not yet exist, it must be enacted through practice. So I think there's more to say about abolition as a practice that cleaves some of the state theories that are in contradiction on the left right now, like anarcho-communist versus social democratic state theories. But I'm going to conclude in the interest of time that, as we think about the directions in which critical theory might go in the future, we might also reckon with the directions that are already in some extent underway. Chris was saying this too, right? The new directions that for the past 50 years have kind of been hiding in plain sight. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for a fascinating contribution. Esteban, would you like to start your presentation? Thank you.
Well, yes, of course. Hello, everybody from Argentina, the paradise of Javier Milei, we can say. So good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank BCA Theory Study Group for organizing this wonderful event and for the invitation, of course, especially Sebastian Raja Mejia and Johanna. I would also like to thank Stephan Lessenich for his enthusiasm, we can say, in sharing this activity with me, along with other many others activity we have been collaborating on recently. We can say in a sense that I'm indirectly his guest. Well, I have titled my brief presentation, The Historical Experience of Mondialization, a Challenge for Critical Theory. I will base my remarks on 3 premises. The first one is that the new intellectual program of the EFS, led by Stephan, and as you said, outlined in the EF working paper number 20, titled Perspectives, in my view, strikes an ideal balance between acknowledging the Frankfurt School tradition and calling for its renewal. The second point is that the process of renewing Frankfurt School critical theory is already underway. This is evident, for example, in the work of Stephan, as well as in the contribution of other distinguished scholars. 2 of them have developed or are developing their careers, we can say there, Johanna, within the vibrant field of British sociology. I'm referring to Zoran Terborn and Gurminder Bambra, for example. And the third premise is that, in my view, the EF program begins by outlining a new historical experience from which it becomes possible to identify the new structural problems facing Europe and the rest of the world. I'm referring to those challenges that should take priority for critical theory in this century. This commitment to understanding the major issues of our society's present historical moments, rather than simply preserving inherited tradition, is, I believe, the very spirit that gave rise to the Frankfurt School in 1923 and propelled it to global recognition. The Frankfurt School became an influential intellectual tradition on the left precisely because it succeeded in conceptualizing in a novel, creative, and powerful way the central problems tied to a specific and situated historical experience. So, in simplified terms, we might assume that all critical theory is shaped at the intersection, we can say, of an historical experience and a structural problem. I think that differentiating between these aspects can be useful for identifying when a critical theory begins to lose its knowledge capacity, its constructive critique, and social transformation. The historical experience of Nazism, and more specifically, the Jewish extermination, led the Frankfurt School, as you know, to identify the loss of individual freedom as the primary structural problem. Without the lasting scars left by this experience, the critical theory produced by the Frankfurt School would have been different. Now, using the new program of the EFS as a key reference point, what I want to highlight is that the historical experience of Nazism, in its original or Frankfurtian sense, we can say, no longer exists. Not exist is evident, not exist in the same way. Therefore, the problem of the loss of individual freedom as the main structural issue needs to be revisited. To say it needs to be revisited means that we must rethink the entire theoretical legacy of the Frankfurt School critical theory. And the way to approach this revision could, in fact, follow the very spirit in which the Frankfurt School was founded, by recognizing a new historical experience, What I like to suggest here is that the central historical experience today, shared by all 5 continents, not just Europe, is the growing mondialization of society, along with their respective defining social problems. I believe this is an experience of considerable magnitude, one that did not exist in the previous century, or at least not as a force powerful enough to displace earlier historical experience and their associated problems. In this sense, and anticipating a possible way of rereading the Frankfurt School, I suggest that if authoritarianism or social totalitarianism is still recognized as a major issue, it will now be understood within the framework of mondialization's historical experience. From my perspective, the historical experience of mondialization is grounded in at least two far-reaching social processes that are transforming both the European continent and the world society as a whole. The first is the accelerating decline of Europe's positions in the world. Stephan Lessenich aptly refers to this process as the semi-peripheralization of Europe. It should be noted that this movement of structural subordination is not new. It began in the mid-20th century. What I believe is new, however, is the way this retreat of Europe has deepened since the 2008 euro crisis, and especially how Europe's decline has accelerated as a result of the current war in Ukraine. This war is threatening the political sovereignty of Europe's core countries, as well as the competitiveness of their national economies, which has long underpinned their level of material well-being. Both of these developments signals the onset of a different type of crisis in Europe. And this point for me is very important. One that is more aggressive and destructive, characteristic of a dependent society rather than a modern society in Frankfurtian terms. It's a crisis and structural fragility that Latin America has experienced for centuries. So what is new then is that Europe is undergoing a gradual process of Latin Americanization, both economically and politically. As Alain Touraine observed in 2013 in his book, The End of Societies, new empires are emerging, and both Europe and Latin America will be relegated to peripheral rules, trapped for sometimes as dependent society within this new global power structure. As you know, very better than I do, concerns about Europe's contemporary decline are hardly new. In fact, it seems to be becoming a new common sense in North-European social sciences, though it has yet to make a significant impact on sociological theory or dominant critical theory. It has also not yet fully resonated within the Frankfurt School tradition, at least not in its classical form. Well, I will move on to conclude my presentation. The other historical process transforming the world and Europe in particular is directly and deeply linked to Europe's loss of power. I'm referring to the rise of a post-colonial world society. This society begins to take shape precisely at the moment when Europe starts to lose its imperial social structure. It's no longer a matter of a modern, autonomous, and self-determined society, as envisioned by the Frankfurt School, but rather a society composed of multiple interacting modernities in asymmetrical relationships. As I see it, the post-colonial world society has been forming since the mid-20th century, driven by at least three key processes. The advanced phase of decolonization, marked by the independent movements in Asia and Africa. The second one, the emergence of a national liberation movements in the global south. And third, the sustained rise of the Asia-Pacific economic bloc, or we can say power bloc, initially centers on Japan, followed by the Asian tigers, and now led by China. It's likely that in the near future, India will also emerge as a global dominant center. So, what are the decisive impacts of the evolution of a post-colonial world society that warrant the attention of critical theory? In short, and among other things, I observed that for the first time in several centuries, the countries, states, and private companies that are steering the evolution of world society, and therefore also the evolution of Europe, are no longer located within Europe itself. One need only look at the annual change in Fortune's list of the 500 global companies to become aware of Europe's current transformations. As Stephan likely knows better than I do, the German company Volkswagen, currently the most valuable companies in Europe on the financial markets, now ranks outside the top 10 global companies. And its current financial and production situation is far from optimal. It appears that Volkswagen is planning to close 3 of its 10 factories in Germany, which would lead to thousands of layoffs from a workforce of around 124,000 employees, as well as significant salary reductions for those who remain there. This is an unprecedented event in the company almost 90 years history. The decline of Volkswagen is largely due to the rise of China in the automotive market, which is itself linked to the expansion of electric mobility. So I will just add one more comment to conclude my presentation. The economic shift in Europe toward China is striking. Since 2020, the Asian giant has become the European Union's largest trading partners in goods, surpassing the United States. And it is China that has been steadily improving its position in this exchange. It's on this, we say, material base, increasingly influenced by the Asian bloc, that Europe's new geopolitical strategy is unfolding. On one focus on strengthening NATO. So without a doubt, the sustained rise of the far right in Europe over the last decade, in all its immigrant and nationalist variants, is closely connected to this movement of decline for the continent and to the turbulence advance of the post-colonial world society. We might then suppose that the new authoritarian right in Europe, what Stephan calls in this presentation the increasing fascist society, we can say, unlike the historical right as reinterpreted in Frankfurt School critical theory, is a fully formed product of the historical experience of mondialization. So, in summary, from today's perspective in 2024, the major planetary transformation of medium duration, which began 70 years ago and is only now shaking the very structures of Europe, has unfolded outside the scope of Frankfurt School critical theory, which understandably focus on the internal tragedies of the industrial societies of the global north in the 20th century. However, as Marx and Fernand Braudel taught us, it's from the problematic present of our historical experience that we must open ourselves to revisionist tasks. In this case, I believe the task ahead is to update the Frankfurt School tradition, its theory of society, as well as its view on modernity, capitalism, and the history of Europe and the world. Personally, I have completed a book titled Late Eurocentrism, in which I aim to contribute, albeit very modestly, to this revision of the Frankfurt School tradition in the light of the historical experience of the mondialization of society. I hope it will be soon available in English for anyone interested in reading it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esteban, for a fantastic presentation and talk. We now have approximately 10 minutes where I would like you to invite the guest speakers to briefly respond to any of the contributions made earlier. After these 10 minutes, we'll take a comfort break for 5 minutes and then we'll have the Q&A. And if we don't have enough questions in the Q&A, of course, we can continue the discussion that is going to start now. So who would like to contribute first?
As all of you three have made reference to the perspectives paper, and I would only like to begin with drawing some lines of interconnection between as I see, between the four presentations and inputs. And I think the first one, what I found very interesting, I think Cecilia, you introduced that, is posing the right questions. So what was the secret of critical theory's success in the first place? back in the 1930s? Posing the right questions, I think. What was then the appeal to younger cohorts of critical theory back in the 1960s and the times of the students' movement? It was that it didn't pose the right questions anymore. Then why and in which ways critical theory lost steam in the 1970s, 80s, 90s? And then what would be the sex appeal, the theoretical sex appeal of critical theory to younger cohorts today? So which perspectives would it have to adopt? And I think these are heuristic questions, very important to reorganize critical theory today beyond what, Chris, you call the philosophical normative strand of critical theory that effectively has run out of steam, I guess. So that would be the first line. Common questions for 100 years of history of critical theory. And interestingly, the second, what I would say, if I look at back into the 1930s, the 1960s, and today, then I would say the link between the conjunctures of critical theory is the historical rise of fascism in the 1930s, in the 1960s, well, in the interpretation of part of the actors in post-Nazi Germany in the 1960s. What was at stake was the return of fascism and neo-Nazism. And today, I think it's pretty much, not pretty much the same, but an analogous situation where fascism is on the rise again, and that calls for critical theory in a sense, as it was in the 30s and the 60s. There would be a second line for me. The third line is protagonists of critical theory overlooked in the reception of critical theory and the history of critical theory, overlooked or ignored or cut out of the picture. So this goes for Alfred Schmidt, this goes for Angela Davis in a sense, and this goes for, if you want to, Latin American dependencia theory, in the sense that if critical theory, European style, would have made more sense of dependencia theory in the earlier decades, then it wouldn't have the problem of late Eurocentrism that Esteban reconstructed. And my last point would be the anti-imperialist and decolonial critique of critical theory, which was important in the 1960s and which is even more important today, I think.
Yes, Chris?
I just wanted to build on those comments by pointing to some similarities I saw in the other three papers. And maybe also raising this in terms of like, what people were saying about going back, but also moving forward. And I think this is sort of the question of, to what extent was there a theory of, a global totality, right? And to what extent could we even say that, that was missing in Marx? There's like these passages where he talks about the world market. People have tried to build on that. So to what extent is that missing in some of their foundations? And is it something that is either missing in the first generation, or is it something that has also become anachronistic? Because when I think of what there may have been in terms of a theory of global totality, it seems sort of inseparable from the Cold War, right? From sort of opposing the Western Bloc to the Eastern Bloc, and maybe you could say there's some sort of implicit theory of, global North, global South relations in there. But even if there is, it seems highly anachronistic. So it seems like, something, a common theme I saw was sort of all three of you pointing to, this sort of missing element, both in the influences on critical theory proper and it seems to me, in critical theory itself. You know,
Yep.
Great. I hope my technology is working well enough for people to hear me. But I just wanted to piggyback on that comment because one of the things I found so interesting about the 1960s student critique of critical theory is that it's precisely this critique that Rudi Dutschke actually says this in 1964. He says, the problem with the Frankfurt School is that its critique of political economy is limited to the economies of advanced industrial societies, and because it doesn't take into consideration their dependency or interdependency on colonial or decolonizing societies, it's able, like Adorno is able to see the integration thesis as to some extent final, right? If they weren't so myopically focused on the Western economies, then they would be able to recognize the anti-colonial, like revolutionary potential of, coming from the decolonizing periphery. So in a way that's the critique that's taking place in the 1960s that I think is directly speaking to this point. But I also wanted to add to Esteban's talk, I felt like I agree that, what makes the critical theory of the 1930s so inspiring still is to the extent that they reinterpreted sort of classical Marxist categories in order to respond to this immediate experience of fascism and anti-Semitism, right? So what motivated the theory's critical transformation is this historical experience. It's very historically rooted. Adorno says this all the time, that truth has a temporal content. And I think to some extent, what's been difficult about the tradition of critical theory that follows is that it feels like it's becoming unrooted from, being motivated by the current historical experience. So I really appreciate that attempt to name our current historical experience as one of globalization. That is the thing that critical theory needs to be responding to and reinterpreting its own categories in order to have a response that seems meaningful.
Great. Well,
Esteban, would you like to?
I can. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, inspiring. All your presentation, Stephan, Chris, and Cecilia. Really, I only want to think to say only one reflection. You say offer only one point to rethink. Stephan calls about the continuity of fascism. But this is a point, I think, Stephan, not only are the fascism, we can say, for the global north and the global south structurally different, because they are structurally different, but it's precisely, this is my thesis, it's precisely because of their structural difference that they can become now a global movement today. There you have the sad relationship between Trump and our government and Milei. Here we have a vassal right-wing groups, elites, that hand over the country to the power and companies of the central or core countries. This is really not new. It's an historical problem of our society. And I think that this is a time, and this is the point of my presentation, and I think this is the part of the base, very interesting for the dialogue we we are strengthening with Stephan, it's a time when Europe at least is becoming, at least Europe, I say, is becoming a structurally dependent society. Not an autonomous one, not an imperialist one, not a dominant one, a dependent society. And I think that Latin American critical theory can help a lot on this, to think about the situation and the development of these new far-right movements in independent societies. This is how I think we need a new theory of society. And my humble proposal, but there is a lot of possibility to develop different kind of vision, is a post-colonial world society or a critical theory of world society. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Now we've got 5 minutes as a comfort break, so let's come back at 32 past and we'll start the Q&A.